Namaste, Jai Hind. Welcome to another edition of ANI Podcast with Smita Prakash. This is being recorded at the Raisina Dialogue held in March 2023 in New Delhi. Today's topic for discussion is on the European Union, its interests in the Asian region. How has the Ukrainian conflict impacted on its foreign policy? Does it have any interest in the Indo-Pacific region? The dynamics with China, has closer European integration come to an end, and will we begin to see power return to national capitals? The speakers today, Mr. Rui Vinhas, Director General of Foreign Policy, Portugal. Rui's held positions dealing with multilateral affairs such as UN and NATO. He was the permanent representative to the Political and Security Committee of the EU in Brussels. Besides an illustrious diplomatic career, he's also authored several articles on international relations and has been published in academic journals. Velina Tchakarova, founder for A Conscious Experience FACE, Austria. Velina conducts strategic foresight and trend analysis for the Austrian Ministry of Defense and is an instructor at the Real World Risk Institute. Tomi Huhtanen, Executive Director, the Wilfried Martens Center for European Studies, Finland. Huhtanen's work focuses mainly on economic and social policy. He's been political advisor for the EPP and has authored many articles. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, Velina, for joining me in this podcast. I'll begin with Rui. Why has foreign policy in the European Union been one of the least integrated elements? Foreign policies of individual states, they're often competing and contrasting with each other in the European Union.
Well, thank you for the invitation. Thank you for having me. Basically, I mean, it's very simple. I mean, it's the core policy of a sovereign state. I mean, it's defense and foreign policy are two of the main policies of quite the core of a sovereign state. So the treaties not yet as organized those policies as common policies of the European Union, but still as policies in which we need a consensus, and the major strengths of those policies, the foreign policy and defense, is precisely consensus in my view. Because the power of the European Union is unity and to speak on behalf of the 27. I mean, but I think that we have our problems, and the decision-making process is sometimes difficult. The negotiation is hard, but as you can see now in probably the major crisis in Europe since its foundation, at least in security terms, the European Union has been quite united in very difficult and tough decisions like sanctions, like supporting the military effort of the Ukrainians. So it's possible, and we can work on this basis, and very successfully, by the way, in this crisis. It's according to my experience. It has been a very good example that, but a discussion on going to qualified majority instead of consensus is there, but we're still far from a decision that will go through revision of the treaties.
Sitting in Asia, we don't see that kind of synchronization as far as views are concerned in the EU on sanctions and China. I will get to that, but Tomi has closer European integration. Is it as good as he's saying, or do you think that it's ending and power is returning back to the national capitals?
So our session today is discussion about what binds Europe, and I think it's interesting when we start to reflect on that. Is a little bit go back and to ask what did originally did bind European Union, what is binding today. So originally, as we know, it was a result of the First and Second World War. The Europeans had killed each other tens of millions and considered that this needs to change, and so the peace was the driving force in the European Union. Then decades passed, and there was maybe, peace what became the new normality, and there was a search for new narrative. And that narrative was prosperity. So purpose peace, prosperity. Second, P, and Europe was focusing on that, on trade, no trade barriers, single market, creation of the euro. But then 2007 and 2008, they were in economic crisis. Again, this question came. So what keeps the European Union together? And now, and then we had also Brexit. So United Kingdom, which India knows very well, went away. But now, currently, we have found, I could say, the third P, problem solving in global scale. We have the climate change, which obviously the Europeans understand that we cannot do it, 27 of us, separately. We have war in Ukraine, the energy crisis, all of that. So that is now the new kind of, I would say, the new reason to be together. Also, with the war in Ukraine, there's a lot of negative and sad aspects of that. But really, I think in that Europe has found a new determination and maybe also unity on this issue. And currently, their development now really for the first time to create common, for example, military industry and really serious discussion for the very first time.
Right. You spoke about the Ukrainian conflict, and Rui also mentions it. Though this podcast is on Europe, but you're seeing on the sidelines, you're seeing that the US, its allies, countries of the South, they're engaged in this war of words when it comes to G20 and especially with regard to the Ukrainian conflict. Even on sanctions, though Rui says that there is a unity, even on that between Eastern European bloc and the Western European nations, isn't there any kind of a conflict or rethink or difference of opinion?
Well, I would say there's a kind of two levels. First of all, if you look at the public opinions, obviously, so there's a massive division in Europe between the countries who feel that they're directly exposed to Russia, to the risk. So it's an existential question. So the discussion in public sphere is very different. Then you have those countries which do not have, with some variation. And for example, in Finland, Nordic countries, Baltic countries, it's very clear they are in favor of sanctions and all of that. Then when you go south, Italy, Greece, which have historic reasons, it gets a little bit more nuanced. But in the public opinion, and by the way, Portugal and Spain, they are there's a very, also among public, there's a very strong support for the sanctions and EU action. So there's more different layers in a public opinion. But in the head of state level, the unity, at least at the moment, is very clear. And we can ask why, maybe because the moral case for Ukraine is so strong. Also with what Russia has been doing in the front, terrible things. I don't start to make a list here. It created the situations for the leaders to say something. Let's try to find a way. Let's try to discuss. It's a very clear. And as just recently, today, Italian Prime Minister was here from these countries, where there's very many opinions about Russia, and her message was very clear on that.
Yes.
And presenting like if you would go to North or Baltic to Estonia, you couldn't have different line. So Europe is very united on that.
On this, claim. Okay. So, Velina, I'm going to come to you now that I'm done with the talking to the men.
Gentlemen.
Yes, and now I don't need to talk to them after this.
You two now, no?
Now it's just between the two of us.
You can leave. I take over. I take over from them.
No, we need them to listen to us, right? Okay. You recently tweeted that the US is quite aware that though China may say otherwise, but the State Department believes that Beijing has clearly taken a side in the Ukrainian conflict. Now, what is the view in Europe? Are they conflicted, or is there a consensus that China is no longer, or China and Russia have colluded?
Well, this is a very interesting question, and here once again we see, depending on where exactly in Europe you're going to look for answers, some kind of let's say diversification of opinions, which is very normal for, let's say, democratic societies, pluralistic societies. People try to figure out things together. Governments, in our case also European institutions, because they have a very significant role to play when it comes specifically to the relationship with the big powers, with the United States, with China, and so on. European institutions also have a saying. And then, of course, citizens. And here, the question on China, right, is going to be an ambiguous one in my personal view. Why? Because first, obviously, the European Union as a collective actor wants to play a significant role in a world that is based on certain rules, mostly, of course, in the field of trade, in the field of economic ties, in all the relevant areas. And for that matter, the European Union, and specifically the big European powers, were convinced, probably this is going to shift a little bit now, depending on exactly that kind of case that you shortly quoted. They were convinced that they need China for that they need, of course, let's say, solid and stable business relations with China. And the previous German government under Merkel even managed to, facilitate the relationship to the point, together, of course, with the institutions, with Brussels, but also with the French counterpart, to even propose a comprehensive partnership on investment. Now, let me also highlight that, for instance, right now the so-called FTA, FTA with India that is being renegotiated is higher in the hierarchy of treaties of the European Commission than a partnership on investment. And yet, this partnership on investment would have set a framework for all member states, for all 27 members, to practically, have a trade relationship with China in a settled manner. Of course, the partnership did not stand any chance and was put on hold a month later when the European Parliament, which is the institution that practically reflects the choice of the citizens, of the European citizens. So you have, a parliament of 702 representatives. They put it on hold, based on human rights violations and labor rights violations, so on and so forth. And this created, coupled, of course, with the mood from the pandemic, where many European states noted that, China was using certain tools to create a positive image, and so on and so forth, created a new kind of, let's say, mood within Europe. And specifically then, what happened was, in the Baltic states with Lithuania, which also kind of shifted towards, on the one hand, improving the relationship with Taiwan by launching an official representation, an official diplomatic representation of Taiwan. It immediately deteriorated the relationship with China. China obviously also was putting representatives from the parliament and from think tanks on sanctions list following this, situation with the failed treaty. So we suddenly had a new situation, and that was prior, to the war. And then, of course, with the war, I'm probably one of the, let's say, few European analysts, and I've been certainly in the minority, who has been pointing to modus vivendi of coordination between China and Russia in various domains, not specifically the defense one, the so-called Dragon Bear. For the last 10 years, following the first invasion, this has never been an issue for discussion in Europe, in the European capitals, maybe in certain close circles, of defense as security pundits, but certainly was not an issue at all. And then with the war, when the war began, and when European officials saw what I was anticipating, that practically China will be disseminating the same Russian narratives. Think of, the narrative. It was a NATO expansion, then the sanctions policy. We saw all of these important narratives being actually disseminated. This was a kind of, I would say, an eye-opener for the European capitals, for the European member states, but also for the European institutions. And now we are in a kind of a limbo, because contrary to United States, which is, I would argue, already in an overt competition, and is taking measures in all of these, relevant areas, and fields, the European Union is in a much more difficult situation.
It's still hesitating to say it. Forget about taking action, right?
It is. We are still struggling, let's say, and I am convinced that we should actually be more open with the specifically towards the risks that may emerge if we are not addressing the issue, because that kind of solidarity that my colleagues were, correctly pointing to, may be endangered in the case of China, because I think that a certain group of European member states would probably go along with the United States, not so much based only on personal conviction, when it comes to the approach to China, but also because they see that the United States is the only garant of their security and their territorial integrity in the future, following the Russian war against Ukraine. And in doing so, there will be another bloc, of course, which is more constructive, which will try to navigate, which doesn't want to get caught in a binary world. It wants to still somehow keep the equilibrium that is right now in global affairs. And this may create a kind of bifurcation within Europe, which I'm really, really practically afraid of. And I think that by addressing the issues, by speaking about it, and it will be a necessity at some point of time, and the moment for me, the red line will be certainly if China decides to deliver military assistance. Because if China decides to deliver military assistance to Russia,
that's the red
we
line.
will end with a proxy war between Russia and Ukraine, where two new system rivals are practically helping the both sides, and where Russia will lose its global power status.
Okay.
That will be my call.
So, okay, Mr. Vinhas, I think very eloquently put out here that the veil has been lifted about, and there's no ambiguity now about China colluding with Russia. Can there be any ambiguity now in all of the EU states? And, because there was ambiguity when it came to the India-China conflict, when it happened in Galwan on our borders. EU was kind of was tiptoeing around the issue, did not come out openly and castigate China or say that this was expansionist policy of China. Now, is it going to be tiptoeing or coming straight out, or does that have to be an attack, or does it have to be military transfers? What needs to be done now for EU to decide, okay, we're going to take action, or we're going to say something?
Well, I mean, that is a complex issue. I mean, first, I agree in generally with what was said. But China, I mean, international relations are dynamic and fluid. If we go back 2 years, the transatlantic relation between the European Union and the US was not so good as it is now. If we go back some more years, the relations between the European Union and India were not in such a good phase as they are now. Actually, it was during the Portuguese presidency of the European Union that we were able to break through and relaunch an economic agenda between the European Union and India in 2021. So this is to say that international relations are fluid, and the dynamics with China go between ups and downs. Now we are not in a hub, but I will not qualify it as something final.
Okay.
Although the Ukrainian war can be a qualitative element in this equation. I mean, if some steps are taken by China, that can represent an issue for the European member states. That's for sure.
Right.
But I will not anticipate.
Not in
Let
the
me
immediate
just,
future.
if I may, in
Sure.
30 seconds. I mean, and picking in what Tomi was saying before, and in your two first questions, I mean, about the European Union. the European Union is it's a very strange animal, at least for the outside world. I mean, even for us in working members of the European Union or working, it's difficult. It's complex. The decision-making process, the division of labor between institutions, the competences between states and Brussels. It's difficult. It's a unique project. It's very beautiful, but unfinished, ever unfinished. It's like the cathedral in Barcelona. The Guaidó, of course, it's never finished. But the fact is that crisis after crisis, and the 21st century has been a century of crisis for the European Union. The financial crisis that Tomi mentioned. Even we have to invent another word because crises are by definition transitional, and we are living in crisis. Then the migration crisis, then the Brexit. After 6 enlargements, it was the first time that a member state of the European Union decided to leave the Union. And then the pandemic, and now a war. And in each and every of these crises, the European Union had come out stronger and united and with more elements of integration. For instance, the answer to the pandemic was extraordinary. I mean, we developed competences in health, public health, that we didn't have before. Buying vaccines and coordinating the answers across Europe, or going to the market and borrowing money, the so-called euro bonds, on behalf of the 27. So these were major steps.
Yes.
In the middle of a huge crisis, and again now in Ukraine, as we were mentioning.
These are the two issues, I think, of divergence.
We have
Ukraine
been united
and China.
and with doing things that we have never done before. For instance, to supply military equipment to Ukraine.
Yes.
Because
it's hard. Tomi, I'm going to come to you. The Indian External Affairs Minister last year, and I quote, he said, somewhere Europe has to grow out of the mindset that Europe's problems are the world's problems, but the world's problems are not Europe's problems. And the German Chancellor repeated the statement at the Munich Security Conference. He said that the Indian Foreign Minister had a point. This is the way Asia sees Europe. Let me tell you, it's not just India. South Asia sees Europe like that. Do you agree, disagree?
Yeah, it was very, very, clear statement.
And very viral.
Yeah, exactly. Very viral. Also, it came very interesting moment because that was exactly the moment when the whole, in the context of whole UN votings and, how India would, there was focus on India, and then came that statement. It's, to a little bit open it up. So of course, the question is, okay, what do you mean exactly? Of course, I know that we know that it was mentioned in the context of Ukraine war. But if you say that Europe doesn't care about world's problems, there's still Europe is giving 75 billion euros, which is what 9,000 billion rupees every year in the world development aid, in the old corners. The EU is presented in all the countries and tries to be involved. So in that sense, that soft element is there. But if you then say that it was meant in a way that in a context that, okay, we had this problem in China, in Himalaya, there are, Indian Ocean, all these questions, and you never said nothing. And now, you have that thing and you come to us to ask sympathy. And okay, well, there one point, we Europeans, because of our history, were quite bad on managing military conflict. Yugoslavia war, it's basically, I can say as a think tanker, it was United States who came to clean the mess. Ukraine also, the situation would not be so good if the United States would not be there with the military assistance and kind of the leadership, because we don't, the kind of mindset is not there and not the capacity. But I think the good news, and there maybe I can be a little bit more sharper, it's that I think that's the point, maybe what was referred in the Munich conference is that it is true that in Europe in general, Asia has been very, very far away. To the point we have been so much mixed up with our own internal issues that even our neighborhood, even in North Africa, which is very close to us, we are not really following very well what is happening, let alone Asia. But now that I think that has changed for the normal people and business CEOs, for the reason that now we understand in Europe that what happens in Asia has an impact in Europe next day. So if China, because of this Russia's aggression to Ukraine, also the question, well, will China make the same move with Taiwan? So if it does, Europeans understand, okay, we have invested massive to China and the whole factories and companies. So if the attack comes, most likely we will have to go to some kind of sanctions as a reciprocity. And then we are in a trouble. And then the focus is on India, exactly maybe also where the Indian stands, but not only, the new possibilities. And maybe that's the silver lining. And maybe, for example, that can be one of part of our agenda, publicly or not publicly, is how to tackle with China, how to do it, because we have a common interest, common concerns. And the last, I personally think that we are. I think Europe. Okay, we are many countries, 20 now, 27, and we have different views. But in these issues, I think we have started to pick a side. If we want to be, as all in Europe, if we say we want to be a global power, but then you have to show leadership. Leadership means choices. You have to make choice. You have to pick your choice. Right. I would pick the choice of India.
Okay.
Other than that.
Concluding remarks, Velina, we were talking about China. How much does Europe really want to get involved? Because as Tomi was pointing out, that it wasn't part of a sphere that Europe was interested in or showed any kind of inclination to be interested in. But now, everybody is interconnected. So now when we talk about EU, geographical borders, cultural borders, where does it stop? And if, like you said, if the China-Taiwan conflict or in the South China Sea, if it gets aggressive, then does Europe get involved? Will Europe get involved? Will it become a bigger issue than it is now?
Are you trying to diplomatically ask me whether Europe would get militarily involved on
yes.
behalf of the United States
Absolutely.
if China decides to launch a military attack on Taiwan?
Because it's a question which is being discussed even in Australia, right? So I would like to know what it is about Europe, like why the hesitation?
Well, you see, this is exactly the point which I was trying to make, that this kind of big risk I see emerging on the horizon. I'm not saying it has to happen like that. And I absolutely agree that international relations are fluid. Things are happening all the time. We have plenty of game changers. And yet there are some kind of objective trends. And one of the things is that it is about credibility. And in that sense, first, I have to say that I am personally not convinced that China is having the intention of launching a military attack on Taiwan in the short term. Now, not only based on what Beijing was seeing happening in the war, in Russian war against Ukraine, but in general, think of the internal, the internal stability paradigm that China is always pursuing. Everything is centered around the topic of having a predictable domestic process. And in the case of a military attack on Taiwan, the whole region with the relevant global choke points that are providing the critical supply for the Chinese population are going to be blocked, not only in a week, but in months maybe, and so on.
Trade routes and everything.
That would mean that people will go on the streets because of the lack of critical supply. But anyway, going back to your main question, and that is, in case of military attack by China on Taiwan, I am not convinced that there will be a coherent approach by Europe. That means European institutions and all the 27 member states when it comes to a response. I'm also not even convinced that we will be able to, let's say, launch these comprehensive sanctions the way how we did that on Russia.
Okay.
That is my point. And yes, the European Union right now is having this kind of, I would say, ambiguous, comfortable line of action and policy towards China. Framing China of a partner on certain issues. It was mentioned climate change, health issues, and so on. Then we have a competitor part that is on economic issues, and then we have the system rival part. And I'm asking myself, if you are framing someone as a system rival, what are you really actually considering
Action points.
Plan as an action plan in case that things really deteriorate? So we may observe, a final sentence on my side, members that will be very, very, let's say, loyal with the American position on that matter, for the sake of their partnership with the United States, first and foremost. And then we will have, more, like I said, more constructive line of policy that will try to, somehow mitigate the risks emerging out of this situation. And we may see sanctions, but not in this scope, certainly not in this scope. Yes, and maybe just, a final remark, which considers India. I think that right now, with this bifurcation of the global system, with the deepening decoupling between United States and China, with Russia's war against Ukraine, which I argue that is also about the future of the global order. It's not just about Ukraine. It's not only about the security order in Europe, but it's also about the positioning of Russia in this newly emerging systemic conflict. I think there may be a big chance for India and the European Union to find a kind of new modus vivendi for a third way, to not get caught in this, Cold War 2.0 mentality, and to, get caught in a binary choices world, but to say we, the two actors, the one is the biggest democracy bloc, the other is the oldest democracy. We can actually merge forces, not necessarily to launch a new non-alignment movement, but to go a third way that create credible counterweight to binary choices, and say we don't need a Cold War 2.0 in this critical period of the international relations.
Okay. Tomi, you disagree?
Yeah, well, okay, that's the third way. I'm not so sure if it's how it will find out. But I wanted to comment on this China. First of all, 2 points. Most likely, okay, we don't know, but most likely China, if China really wants to go after Taiwan, there's various phases. I think most likely, because you cannot just launch an attack. It's not like I take my car in the front of the house and just go. It will be visible for months and months and months, because it's a massive logistic operation. But we can assume that what China could do, for example, have a military exercise around Taiwan which lasts forever, and nobody can come in and out, and then test the waters and see what the dynamics. But for your direct question about military assistance, the reality is we don't have the material, not the equipment in Europe. And that's actually our big problem, and that's actually is the discussion. So I think the biggest support what Europe in that situation realistically could give is related to sanctions. But military assistance, no. Americans we don't have anything, but the Americans would like to.
That's a question which I want to come to you, Rui, because has this war blurred the separation or the lines between NATO and EU as far as defense policy is concerned?
No, we're not yet there, because there's a difference between the membership of the two organizations. In the EU, for instance, we still have neutral countries, Ireland, Austria. Just to give 2 examples, Finland and Sweden are about to leave that status, and that is something that it's important when we explain what we see and what we think and we feel in Europe with this aggressive posture of Russia, is how 2 countries that were neutral, one during 200 years, Sweden, and the other one almost 80 years. In a few weeks after the invasion of Ukraine, they gave up that neutrality status, which is very impressive. And why is that? Because they felt that neutrality was not enough anymore to provide security to their countries. So, but in that sense, we're still far from that, which is not a negative thing. I mean, we have NATO, which is a political military alliance, defense alliance, which takes care of collective defense of its members. And the European Union, as Tomi was saying in the beginning, it's mainly a peace organization. I mean, defense started. It's a new dimension, a relatively new dimension in the European Union. It started in the 90s, and very baby steps, and now it's bolder. But still, it's not the core business of the European Union. And because as Tomi was saying, it's basically peace, prosperity, democracy are the three pillars of the European Union, and that's very important to understand. I mean, you cannot find more peace lovers in any other region than in Europe. After 2 world wars in which more than 80 million people died, the European Union was created to assure that we have peace in Europe. And we have never, and it's basically an economic organization and not oriented to a military. So we have, for all reasons, to develop a stronger capacity in terms of defense at the level of the European Union, and to be more autonomous. That's important. But NATO is still the cornerstone of the European defense.
Right.
Yes.
Just before I conclude, I have 2 points which I want to touch on. Maybe you can answer that, both of you could answer that. One is, the refugees who are coming in, the integration of the refugees. Because there is a view that the Scandinavian countries, this burning of the Quran which has taken place, it's caused a little bit of a disruption in the polity, among the people, with this influx of refugees. If you could both tell me a little bit about these issues with the influx of refugees. And now you have even from Ukraine, and then there are the climate refugees who are going to come in. I think there are already some 8 million of Ukrainians in Europe already. So how is the refugee problem going to be resolved in the countries, culturally as well as, both of you could. Velina, you could just...
I can start first as a 100% immigrant who actually has been saying that for the last 20 years, that I'm a perfect example for a successful, at least I would like to think so, successful European integration. Mm-hmm. As someone who was born in one country, moved to study in another, and got the education from a second, and then has built the whole life in a third one, and representing this third one as an Austrian citizen, I am absolutely strongly propagating that Europe, given the objective demographic processes in this continent, which are pointing to a very, let's say, pessimistic future in terms of labor force, in terms of, the population. You only need to take a look at the eastern part of Europe.
Yes.
It's devastating. I mean, there are countries like my home country, Bulgaria, together with Japan. These are the 2 countries in the world that are having the biggest issue of, not just aging, but disappearing population. So migration, if handled rightly and, with the right political measures and communicated right in the right manner, is a good thing. Mm-hmm. It's a good thing. Now, what is the problem? The problem is that, of course, and it was already pointed out, it's a continent built on peace, prosperity, stability. Once the prosperity part is starting, to shake, we had, as you heard, economic crisis, financial crisis, and so on and so forth. Populist forces are always capitalizing on the migration card, always. And because of that, the traditional, party forces are trying somehow to cope with this phenomenon at home, because in democratic societies, every politician has to go to the elections after 4 years. That is the reality. So migration has been, let's say, handled probably not in the best collective way, but a lot has happened since then. A lot. I mean, since 2015, a lot has been done at the European Union level and also within the member states. And yet, of course, again and again, and this is now again the case after pandemic and after a war is always inflationary, the repercussions are huge, specifically for the small countries. Once again, we have the issue that, of course, the migration card is being used. Now, I'm not going to refer to the case in Sweden because I don't know all the details, so I will refrain from a comment. But I will only say that you should also consider migration as something that nowadays, because of an interconnected world, as a phenomenon that can be also weaponized. Because, and I can give you a concrete example, like the case with Belarus, that has facilitated migration corridor that was before the war and practically exercised pressure on 3 concrete European Union countries. This corridor was facilitated probably with the help of other external actors. But anyway, nowadays this is also possible. You can exercise political pressure on states by using the migration card. So you have 2 leverages. You have the domestic leverage, because you're exercising pressure on politicians, and then you have the external pressure. So this is also reality, but given the points that you made, climate change, conflicts, military, conflicts, wars, the migration is something that is here to stay, and it needs to be tackled in a right manner. It needs to be communicated to the people because, and I will give you a final example. Alone in Germany, in the next 15 to 20 years, there will be probably 15 million people that will be retired, 15 to 20 million, according to the official statistics. This is 1/4 of the whole population. So the migration is the only solution for these countries to actually keep vibrant economies.
Right. I'll give you the final word before we
in short, we are running out of time.
Yes.
So first of all, you mentioned the climate immigration. In fact, the current wave, which you mentioned, the numbers are big. Basically, it's because of the war in Syria and war in Ukraine. Those have created those immigrant refugee flows but the difference, for example, to 2015 situation, which, as you know, we had huge flow of refugees coming from south. The difference is this is now what we call legal immigration. So those who are coming from Ukraine, they have a permission. It's going rather well. In the sense, there's various reasons for that. First of all, because Ukrainians, they're mainly, women and children. So, in the public mind, you have this vision of, we know what is happening. So basically, men are going to battle, and the mothers with their children going to live in the country. It's heartbreaking. So of course, the population has a different attitude. Ukrainians have also. There's many Ukrainians already before who have networks in Europe. So there's a lot of ways of them to tackle the challenge. So that's one which is helping. So the political problem is at least not yet there. Secondly, for the future waves, I think there has been for 3, 4, 5 years a lot of question on border control and the whole asylum process, make it faster, quicker. So I think when if refugees come or flows of people to Europe, I think it will be tackled. But you pointed right. The issue, as it was mentioned already before, we have the big aging problem in Europe, which you don't have here in India, but we do. But for even knowing that, somehow we don't manage the immigration part. There is no really good case in Europe where this integration of the immigrants to the country itself is going very, very well. Sweden was considered one of the model countries for years. But actually, what happened?
It fell apart.
Yeah, basically, many issues were not discussed, and left. Things got accumulated. But that will be the challenge. And actually, there's a commission, heads of European Commission, and new leaders coming to India also to now to market
Yes.
Europe as a place to work, because the need is there. We need that. So we need people to
Expertise,
come to
yeah.
Europe, but we don't have the mechanism to have. We haven't found the silver bullet how to make this integration work, and that is the challenge.
Right. So, like I was saying about this integration, I'll give you the final word, Rui. That what holds European Union together? Geographical, cultural ties. What is that thing that holds it together? Final point.
All of that. I mean,
All of it.
All of it. Yes. Geography, culture, of course, values.
Values.
That is, of course, and the shared objectives, as we were all mentioning. Just a quick word, if I still have
Yes,
time,
sure.
on the perceptions. I mean, perceptions sometimes are more important than everything else in international relations, but we should not be led by perceptions only. This is this crisis of around Ukraine, of the war in Ukraine. It's a very serious one, and we need to talk to each other. I mean, and prevent any cleavage between the West and the rest, or the North and the South. We need to talk, to listen. We in Portugal, we are in the far west coast of Europe, and by history, geography, geopolitical condition, we are used to talk to everyone and to bridge sometimes. And we think it's very important to listen to the others, to their concerns with this crisis, but also to explain from our perspective in Europe what is going on. And this is a serious issue. And it's important to talk. And this Raisina dialogue, I think it's very
The
important
dialogues are
that we
important,
listen
yes.
to each other and can understand better the different points of view.
Thank you so much. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, Velina. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Thank you for watching or listening into this podcast. Do like or subscribe on whichever channel you have seen this or heard this. Namaste, Jai Hind.